Right, how are you doing everybody? Welcome to Russell Heritage Golf. Yes, it is getting colder here, much colder. First time I've had to wear this for quite some time. It's pretty chilly. This video today is all about my personal experiences, I suppose, ultimately, and the one move and one motion that has fundamentally changed my outlook on not only my own golf, which I'm hoping once we get past 2020, which has been, for obvious reasons, a horrendous year, but going into next year, ultimately trying to set more time aside to practice so that I can share that information with you. But ultimately, this move completely changed my outlook on my golf coaching as well. Now, in today's video, it is going to be really insightful for lots of you, because I'll talk about what the sort of problem was, the sort of inconsistency that it caused me as a golfer from a day-to-day basis, and the things that I often used to fight. And you'll be like, oh wow, that's me. I used to fight that, and I fight that, and I compensate in the same sort of way. And you'll find that hopefully really transparently helpful. But ultimately, I'm going to share with you how you stop doing the problem as well, and how by eliminating this problem, it does liberate your movement and your progression and make you a much better golfer. So shall we start? Let's go. So as I hit a few shots to warm up, ultimately, you know, my sort of background is that as an amateur golfer, I got down to a good level. So played off a +3, sort of plus, I was always fluctuating between +2, +3 handicap. And like most golfers, you tend to give the lowest version of yourself. And yeah, got down to a decent level as an amateur golfer. Was always looking for that bit more, and always ultimately knew that maybe my golf swing wasn't quite consistent enough. Now, this video is going to be broken down ultimately into two series. The first part of this video is the move that has set aside everything that I need to do. The second part of the video was the biggest mistakes that I've made. And I just think, like I said, it's going to be a really transparent portrayal of how I've evolved as a coach and as a golfer, and how I'm going to improve. Now, similar to all amateur golfers, obviously I can play some decent golf, but forever felt like I was fighting inconsistencies and timing, and would often have periods of time where I'd be standing on a tee with out of bounds down the right hand side, terrified of a bad shot coming, and would often end up sort of double crossing myself and hitting like a pull hook. And it would just kind of feel ultimately like it came out of nowhere. But just used to find, yes, even as a +2, +3 handicapper, ultimately the consistency was not always about one round of golf. See, for a 20 handicapper, 18 handicapper, maybe even a 9 handicapper, playing 18 holes consistently is really a difficult thing to do. The problem is that when your level gets better and better, so you start to get to a very low handicap, and especially when you start to get to a plus handicap, it's not even about 18 holes of golf ultimately. When you're trying to compete in events, it's about successfully playing well on successive days. So it's about being able to play well for 4 rounds of golf, or even as an amateur, 2 to 3 rounds of golf. And that's what I was trying to say. I just wasn't consistent enough to get across that line, and would feel like I was always firefighting to some sort of degree. Now, ultimately, don't get me wrong, also I didn't work hard enough at it, didn't practice the nitty-gritty things that ultimately you need to do, especially in the winter here when it gets so cold. And one of the things that I'm very passionate about with people that I work with, and again I'm going to start talking about more on the channel, is just some different ways to practice to give you this sort of enthusiasm to want to do it, and equally not to waste your time just doing the same thing time and time again. So yes, there was an element that if I look back at it in all transparency, I should have worked harder, but still it wouldn't have changed the feelings that I ultimately had. Okay, so the sort of question you should probably be asking yourself by now is, Russ, will you please be quiet and just tell us ultimately what it is that you're actually struggling with? And I will. The problem was, I was always very spinny. And you see this is really commonplace, not only in the amateur game from the higher handicap, extreme, more beginnery golfer, but also very much down to the lower tier, better golfer. See, pretty much every aspiring professional that I've ever had the opportunity to work with falls foul of this exact motion, and it is spinning out. Now, what spinning out ultimately means is, as you start the downswing, as you start to trigger a rotation, your trail hip, so my right hip, would come forward. The point is though, first and foremost, is that that's the fault. So if that's what you wanted to know, this video is all going to be about spinning out. And the problem is that the only ways that I knew how to eradicate it by having lessons at the time was either to accept it and to just try and play more of a fade type shot. But the problem with the fade type shot is it meant as I would spin out, the shaft would come down quite vertical, and yes, I could play and I could compress the golf ball, but with the longer clubs, because of the steepening effect, because of the spinning effect, the ball flight was low. So like linksy golf and stuff was great because I could hit a 2-iron like a submarine missile just off the ground, but I was never really that good with driver. And ultimately, if I didn't like the idea of just squeezing the golf ball and squeezing the living daylight out of the ball, which what I mean by squeezing is this sort of compression feeling, then ultimately I felt like at times I had no plan B. The other problem is, you know, when you start spinning out as much as I was, it doesn't matter how good your wrist angles are, you're always going to end up probably swinging too much out to in. And like I said to you earlier, the problem with too much out to in meant unless I kept that face open and would start to hit quite a strong sort of fade shot, it ultimately meant that I'd end up double crossing myself and hit that sort of hook massively into trouble. So there'd be periods of rounds of golf where I'd be able to play that. I'd be able to stand there with my spinny hip and hit a fade. And I could probably get it around and manage my way. But there were equally times when I used to play golf where I didn't like it. I'd be like, hang on a sec, I don't really like hitting a 15-yard curve in towards a hole. I want to hit it straighter than that. And the other option was, well, okay, turn back more and bring your arms down ultimately, and then feel that more release and that more rollover. So if you like, it would be like the old sort of lessons. Okay, if you're fading it too much, try and play a draw. Okay, and then the problem is that might work periodically for a short space of time, so I would stop fading it as much. But then when I was playing around a golf, I still had huge amounts of difficulty because my eye was fluctuating between the idea of trying to hit a draw and trying to see a draw, having previously played this fade and this sort of, and it was just so difficult to play a round of golf and to get some sort of continuity of movement. So I felt like I was doing the same thing and progressing throughout my whole season rather than firefighting the fade because it became too fadey and too slicey into a draw, inevitably waiting for the time when the draw became too hooky and blocky. And then what do? I go back to my fade feeling, and then that might work, and then I've got to go back to my draw. And it was like I got so frustrated, which is then the reason why I started going down the routes of trying to change my swing completely, trying all sorts of different methods, which I'm not saying is the wrong thing ultimately to do. And we're going to talk about that more in the next video that's going to come out on the channel in a couple of days. But the move ultimately that I had to master is the one I talk about so much on the channel now. Move is, if you like, classed sometimes on the channel as the recentering, but it's also, we talk about hip depth. And I basically just talk about the importance of not spinning out. So again, just to clarify, spinning out is when you pull the lead hip back and the trail hip comes forward. Makes you potentially swing too much out, or you then start compensating, like I say, start triggering early hip extension because you're just desperately trying to fight that sort of feeling of over the top. You then start getting really handsy, and like I said, the whole thing just becomes messy. Ultimately, the one move that completely changed my outlook on everything that I do now, whether coaching or playing, down to the sole ability to, in the backswing position, get hip depth. Hip depth by definition means my right hip is working back behind the original sort of line where it starts, as opposed to say this way. So I get my hip depth, I get my trail hip back. It's then to keep my trail hip back as I pull my lead hip back. So I transition more this way. This gives me much more space and means that as I come in towards the hit, I can neutralize club path. Like I said, I get a little bit spinny, I can potentially get a little bit steep and have to compensate. And again, if you get a little bit spinny this way, you then feel like you're trying to early hip extend to neutralize the club path, and the whole thing's inconsistent. And the frustration is that the whole problem was all answered in one movement, and it's the one movement that I talk about so much on the channel, which, if you like, is this sort of squatting motion of getting the right hip back, keeping the right hip there as you pull the lead hip back. It's so important because it just gives you space then to do whatever you want to do. And ultimately we see this with all professional golfers. The ones that are generally moving really well are the ones that look like they're in sequence. They're the ones that go back, pull the lead hip back and swing through. The ones that look like they're all over the place are the ones that are basically on the tiptoes and then the saturating space. And again, I'm not saying you can't hit the ball straight from there, but the bigger picture when you're looking at your golf swing is ultimately past 18 holes. You have to start looking at the changes you're making towards your golf swing are ultimately influencing your proximity to the hole throughout the whole season. So like I promised at the beginning of the video, not only would I tell you what the fault is, but I also said we would talk about how to fix it. A lot of you are going to smile about this drill because you've seen it many, many times before, but I'm hoping that this type of video and talking more personally is really going to motivate you guys to practice it now. 2 chairs. 90-degree angle. It's probably the perfect training aid to help you guys feel the correct sort of motion for transition ultimately. I get set up, I swing the club up towards the top of my backswing position, and ultimately what you need to do in the top of the backswing position is get the right hip to push the chair back. Now as you transition, like I say, the thing that we want to avoid is any sort of spinning motion, which is where the right hip comes off the chair. You need to keep your right hip on the chair as you pull your lead hip back. But ultimately, it's completely acceptable to move with a little bit of linear motion in your golf swing, which means you don't want to get your right hip back and your left hip back on the chair and move this way, because this is still going to cause that spinning out motion. What you want to do from said position is keep the right hip back, but get your lead hip back into the pocket of the space at the 90-degree angle that's created between the 2 chairs. It's acceptable to move with a linear motion, which means this way. And what this is doing is this is keeping my trail hip back and out of the way as I then can pull my arms into this space, therefore giving you tremendous amounts of consistency. Like I say, this then becomes the one thing and one of the key moves that I'm basically looking for in my golf swing. If I was to video my swing, I'm making sure that I retain that tush line and feeling that hip depth, which basically means keeping that right hip back, regardless then as to whether I'm trying to draw the golf ball or fade the golf ball. Neither of those feelings of drawing or fading, those are basically hands and arm movements. Okay, those are things that my hands and arms are doing differently, and we'll talk about that when the time's right on the channel. But whether I am hitting a 8-iron or whether I am hitting a driver does not make a difference. Whether I'm hitting a fade, whether I'm hitting a long iron, ultimately this is such a key move, and it's why I talk about it, like I said, so much all of the time on the channel, because of these exact reasons, that not only has it worked for me, but it's worked fundamentally for thousands of golfers that I've met over the years, and it has completely changed their golf swings, liberated them to play much more consistent golf all of the time. But also somebody pointed out on the channel in the YouTube comments the other day in the video that it's not always about, people are understanding now that have watched the channel that yes, there are times when you might need to just make a subtle tweak and alteration to help you hit the ball a little bit straighter, but fundamentally you also understand the bigger picture behind the practice that you should be doing. And that's it. So hopefully you've enjoyed the video. Always appreciate one of those. Remember, it's free to subscribe. If you're going to do so, press the little bell icon, because that means you'll receive notifications every time a new video comes out. Another great video coming out in a couple of days. They're all great, they all help you, but another great personal video that's coming out in a couple of days. You don't want to miss that one either. See you guys again really, really soon.